Awesome. So just want to say a few words and then we'll dive into conversation. Again, my name is Denaja Pendergrass Thomas. I am the new director of the Placement Exchange, better known as TPE. I've been in this role since October and have had the wonderful opportunity of getting to know a small but mighty committee who is dedicated to making the spring event really successful and thinking about what it means to expand TPE. For those of us, or for those of you who may be new to the TPE experience, the Placement Exchange is sponsored by 7 National Student Affairs Associations, but it's jointly managed through ACU Hawaii and NASPA. And our goal is to be the definitive resource for our colleagues in the field for the job placement process. What most people don't know is outside of the spring event, we do have TPE 365. And our aim with TPE 365 is to acknowledge and respond to the kind of evolving reality that we can all speak to, which is that placement and career advancement or entry really is a year-round experience. We're pretty far removed now from folk waiting till April or March to look for that job. Everyone starts on July 1, and we kind of follow this yearly cycle. And so our goal with TPE 365 is to really look at the factors with some intentionality around how can we create a space where higher education student affairs professionals come together for community with conversations and dialogues like this one, access resources, and then of course continue to improve the marketplace or the placement process so that as a whole, we are talking about everything from recruitment to retention to advancement when it comes to the workforce in higher education student affairs. And so within that, the committee and I started to talk about factors that contribute to this. And I'm sure all of us can name a myriad of them. We know salary is one of them. Everybody's talking about salary in higher ed, but they're also talking about salary in nonprofit in the private sector too. But there's some other factors. What is your industries or what is your organization's culture like? What is diversity like? And of course, what is it like to be supervised at your organization? And so the committee, without a doubt, was like, Denaja, if we're going to start conversation around factors that influence the job search process holistically, we've got to start with supervision. And so this is the launch of TPE Talks, a place where we hope to come together and have conversations that we know happen in some of our group meetings and some of our unique community groups on social media and just over lunch with colleagues. How do we bring them to the forefront and talk as professionals with some other conversation partners? And so today's conversation is Supervision Matters. We do have 4 guests with us. I hesitate to call them panelists because they're not going to lecture with you, and this is going to work by me posing some questions to them, letting them share some of their experience and wisdom, and really opening up the space for you all to ask questions and contribute to the conversation. So we really do want this to be a lunchtime conversation. So in just a moment, I will stop talking and let them introduce themselves. I have one question to get them jump started, but I'll also be monitoring the chat in case questions or comments pop up. So please feel free to engage in the conversation and dialogue. We hope that it will be fruitful and meaningful, and we recognize that it is probably just going to be the tip of the iceberg when it comes to talking about something that is so pivotal to the success of our workforce. So I will put up a slide so that you can see everyone, and then Marion, would you get us started? I apologize. I'm not running dual screens, so you're not going to get to see my slide. So Marion, would you introduce, and then we'll go with Mo, LaFarron, and Oliver.
Hi, all. Good afternoon from where I am, Winston-Salem, North Carolina. My name is Marianne Tratner, she, her pronouns. I currently am serving as the Assistant Director of Wellbeing and Health Promotion in the Office of Wellbeing at Wake Forest University. I've been here about 2.5 years. And prior to that, worked in various wellbeing capacities at the University of Texas at Austin for 11 years. So if there are any native Texans on here, it's good to see you. Thank you so much to Denaja for this opportunity to speak with you all today. I'm going to pass it over to Mo.
Thank you, Marian. Hey, y'all. Mo Samad, he, him, his pronouns, Associate Director for Inclusive Excellence within our Residence Life program here at Ohio State University. I've spent a majority of my career within residence life in the Midwest and had a stint out east at Johns Hopkins. And a lot of my primary focus now in my current role, in addition to supervision, is the training, development, policy procedure as it relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So hoping to bring some of that into the supervision conversation as well. Nice to meet you all, and I'll pass it to LaFerrin.
Good afternoon. My name is Dr. LaFerrin Merriweather. I'm the Associate Director for Residence Life at UNC Greensboro. So right down the street from Marion. And I do all things Res Life. And I have been in the Southeast region for all of my career. At this point, my pronouns are she, her, and hers. And I look forward to this conversation today. Supervision has taken up a lot of conversation in the 11 plus years I've been doing this. So here we are.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Oliver Thomas. I am a stone's throw away from Dr. Merriweather at North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University. I serve as the Interim Director of External Affairs in the Office of the Chancellor for the university. I've been in higher education 15, 16 years, and been at A&T now going on a year and a half, but I've been at Wake Forest and UNC Greensboro too. So I know the triad pretty well, and looking forward to this conversation. In fact, just walked out of a meeting at 11 o'clock with a colleague talking about supervision. So I won't reveal some of those things because they're HR personnel matters, but we'll talk a little bit.
Awesome. Thank you all for your introductions. Without further ado, let's just start talking. Very simple question. Why does supervision matter?
I'll kick us off. There are several reasons why I think supervision matters. For me, as a supervisor and as a leader, I see supervision as a way of growing leaders. So that's number one. So supervision is not something that just happens in passing. It's something that I think does need to happen intentionally because I'm growing other leaders. Number two, I don't assume that the person that I am supervising will be in the role forever. And so I think about them as someone who is going to add to the overall narrative of the university, that they are not simply an extension of me, but they are their own person and they offer unique perspectives to the university. And then number three, supervision, I think, is important because I am also supervised. And so because I have a supervisor as well, it's important in terms of relationship building, growth. But again, what do I need to learn? What do I need to do differently that will help me not only as a supervisor, but also as a supervisee?
I'll definitely go after that. I think the reason supervision matters because it provides three things: direction, accountability, and opportunity. So direction in terms of where we're going, which talks a lot about communication. And this is why you were here, why you were hired. What's your position description say, and how do I help you? And how does this fit into the direction of where we're going as a department or division or an institution? The accountability part, how am I helping you stay accountable to what we have asked you to do? And a lot of these things are two-way streets. So like if I have set expectations or I have not, like there's some accountability with me holding you to those expectations, but also on the other end, if I have not done that and you being like, yeah, you want me to do this, but we didn't talk about it. So I think it's a two-way street as well. And then opportunities, to what Oliver said, like, I don't suspect that my staff will be doing this forever, but my hope is that I have created opportunities to grow them in who they are in their skills so that when they move on to do whatever, whether that is in student affairs or outside of it, that they have the necessary skills to do the work. Because I do believe that we don't teach people how to be good supervisors. We just assume that they're able to do it, and that is a problem. And so it also creates opportunities to actually develop good supervisors, because we know that people will leave people before they leave they'll leave like their reason for leaving the organization is because of the people, not because of the organization. It's because of the people who have been put over in quotations over them to guide them through this process.
Yeah, I highly agree with Drs. Thomas and Merriweather, and I'll supplement what they haven't yet said about why this matters. With the caveat of my experience is a little unique in that I was came to Wake Forest, was here for about 7 weeks as the assistant director for the office, and then had the opportunity to serve in an interim director role and served as interim through the pandemic. Well, we're still in the pandemic, but we hired our new permanent director in June of this year. And so, yeah, I was not giving any formal training about supervision or what that means. I do have 2 degrees in social work. And so I have leaned heavily on my social work education and my lived experience around working with colleagues and thinking about who are the supervisors in the past that I have really grown from and who have mentored me. But I think in addition to, again, what was already said, why supervision matters is that it builds connection and belonging within your department, or it should. Like, I think good supervision should do that. It also helps to increase morale. If I know my staff is struggling in an area or working through something, I am going to be there working with them as opposed to for them to help them increase morale in my department. It also prevents mistakes from happening. So we have, to Dr. Merriweather's point about communication and expectations. If I know that my staff is struggling with a project during our one-on-one, or I hear of something that they have shared that I see, oh, this is sort of problem could get worse, I can prevent it from getting worse before if I know about it and happening, right? And help to them learn from failure if failure is happening in that moment. And then I think also it matters because it helps us to create a culture of safety and inclusion and well-being in our departments. So, and I think for me, in a variety of ways, as a white person, I really need to tune into that work. And so I've had conversations with my staff when they have, had a bias incident report on them. I've had to have conversations around DEI. We have constantly having conversations around DEI, but we also talk about moments of harm that have occurred in our space and outside of our space, right? And all of that wouldn't happen if I didn't have that constant communication and good supervision with my team.
I think similarly to all that's been shared by our colleagues here on this call, I think all that's spot on. I would bring that all together and call it organizational culture, and that it's embedded day in, day out through everything that we do within an organization. And I'll take it a step further, and I appreciate Oliver and others bringing up this idea of, I don't expect folks to be in a specific role permanently for their entire career. And I highlight that piece because I think there's this unrealistic expectation, right? When we hire folks on, right, people quantify it as loyalty. Nah, we can't do that, right? And so sometimes these organizational structures or these organizational cultures, right, want this loyalty from staff, but in return don't give that same loyalty when stuff hits the fan, so to speak, right? And so I think supervision is embedded into that organizational culture, that organizational structure. And then the other piece that LaFerrin and Marion and others brought up is supervision embedded into that culture also brings about retention and recruitment. And I know we're going to get into this later on, but how you treat folks during the time spent with you is how folks are going to go out and speak about their experience. And so you need to constantly think of recruitment and retention through supervision, knowing that the moment that someone takes on a varying opportunity outside of the field or inside of the field, but not at your specific institution, or maybe even at your specific institution, just not within your unit, right? They're going to speak about their experience. And how do you want them to speak about their experience, right? You want them to do it authentically. You want them to do it in a way that they experience said opportunities. And I think supervision lends a hand into that overall process, right? If you had a bad supervisor, folks come in knowing who to watch out for. Let's be real, right? If you had a good supervisor, even if you don't supervise that line, folks go in and gravitate towards that person because they've already heard it from elsewhere. And I think that's important too.
Man, we're not going to need my prompt questions. You guys are ready to go. I think where I want to first come around to, you all said so many pivotal things as to why supervision matters. And at the same time, if I were to take a straw poll and ask you, was there a manual waiting for you when you walked in to your role as supervisor? And willing to bet all four of you would say absolutely not. And so we can name that there are such pivotal responsibilities and such a burden and high expectation placed on the importance of supervision. And yet I can't recall ever receiving the handbook on supervision. I think, Marianne, you leaned into it a little bit. You said, well, I got a background in social work. So I pulled on some transferable skills, which is a plug for a program we'll have later in January, and the modeling of good supervision or strong supervision that you've experienced. But there's not a lot of development and training around skill building for supervisors to match the expectation. So knowing that, how did you come to grow in the skill set that you needed to provide training and development, create environments where there's connection, belonging, and high morale, to help people prevent mistakes, to do all the things that you said were necessities and importance of supervision? How have you built those skills to do that well?
I think you hit the note when you're talking about how we learned, right? So I think I learned how to be a supervisor both from good and bad examples, because when you saw the bad examples, you're like, I do not want to do that. And when you saw yourself going down that road, you're like, whoa, remember we said we were going to do this, and having to do a self-check about like, no, let me roll this tape back, because that's not it. I think one of the things too, I have prided myself on being a good supervisor because of my experiences with not so positive interactions. And then in retrospect, years later, I've had to kind of give grace to those people, because what I realized is that they were not prepared for the role to supervise. And also understanding identity pieces play into that. Marianne hit it before in terms of like, I have to understand that those things play into it, right? Like, so how my supervisor interacted with me and what my expectations were based on who I am as a person, and how she was as a person, or he was as a person, or how they were as a person, it also dictated how we interacted. And so understanding that supervision it's not a one size fit all. There are certain things about my supervision style that I am consistent on some very principled things, but also knowing that I have to adjust. And so for me, it was learning from those experiences versus positive or negative. And then realizing and doing self-reflection on places where I needed more growth as a person, to be able to do what I said I wanted to do, right? I wanted to be a person who had open communication with my staff. When staff are like, I want transparency. And I always tell them, your definition of transparency and my definition of transparency are two different things. You are asking for us to communicate in a way that you understand what's going on so that you can move forward and do your job. I always tell them there are certain things that you cannot know. And what I'm going to do is tell you, I can't tell you that. This is where we are, and it's okay. But I'm going to tell you what you need to do in order for you to continue to move forward. Like, we got a vision. You've been given the vision. Here's your part of the vision that you are responsible for. Please do that. I'm going to give you the information so that you can. But I learned that from my previous experience with things. My background is in business, so I don't have a traditional student affairs background, and I was taught to manage people, processes, and systems. So I draw on that a lot in this work, because that's what we do. And I think sometimes, and I talk about student affairs programs a little, I have problems with them sometimes. No shade to people who teach in them. but we have to teach people about the business of student affairs in higher education. And a big piece of that is the management of people. And what does that look like? And that's where skill building, I think, begins.
I think both of y'all hit on something critical and y'all just glanced over it, right? Y'all both threw out this word learn. And I think it starts at that. You've got to exhibit a willingness to learn, right? And I'll quantify it this way. Oftentimes when I give sessions on or work with staff on coaching or evaluations, right? We in student affairs like to talk about it happens every time you meet with someone, right? Nowadays, you have to spell out, hey, we're going to do coaching conversation, or we're going to sit through an evaluative conversation, right? Because folks don't see these engagements, these interactions any longer as you're coaching me. You're providing me an opportunity to learn, to grow, to develop. And I think that's critical, is at times we have to spell it out a bit more concretely or a bit more clearly, right, for staff to engage. And so I think what's important, and what both of y'all shared, is this willingness to learn, this willingness to grow and develop as a supervisor from both the good and the not so good. And then I also think what LaFerrin was getting at the end, to me at least, was owning our gaps, right? We can't be everything to all people, and we can't be a great supervisor in all facets of supervision, right? And so we need to own that. And the example that I'll give there is, oftentimes we in student affairs see like an RA or a student staff member who is succeeding, and we automatically want to put them in a higher ed program somewhere. They don't want to do that, right? And we should take some of that and implement it into how we supervise staff, right? And I think this goes back to our earlier conversation of someone who may be with me in residence life may be doing it for this 2-year period or this 3-year period. And so how do I hone in and personalize their experience to where then they're able to take that skill set and go and build on it elsewhere? And I think that's critical too, right? That opportunity to learn, grow, and develop.
To LaFerrin's point around systems, at this level, being in the chancellor's office, the experiences that I've had over the years in various institutions, but also my work as a minister. I'm an ordained minister with a Master of Divinity. So like Mary Ann, many of my experiences, I lean into my teaching and training, and some of those around family systems, some of those around trauma-induced and trauma-informed responses, that at this level in the chancellor's office, oftentimes we are fixing something. Like all the time we are fixing something. And what can happen is, as a supervisor, because you're always fixing something across campus for the university, you actually fall into the trap of fixing the people who you supervise. And that is a very dangerous trap to fall in, because people don't need to be fixed. This is the coaching to grow. This is knowing who people are. But for me, when I lean into my MDiv work and experience, I actually ask myself, so who's responding out of their trauma with another supervisor? Who's responding from their own family systems around how they think this should happen? I've supervised folks who say, well, I just want you to tell me what you want me to do. Well, what I want you to do is I want you to be a critical thinker. What I want you to do is to help me with the systems, because I'm not the only person who can do this. I can't think of all these things by myself. I can't do all these things by myself. So that's what I want you to do. And that's a struggle for many people. For me, as a supervisor, one of my challenges is I'm a big picture person. I work a lot in philosophy. And so because I work a lot in that realm and idea, right, I can be what feels like all over the place. But then when I want something done, I want it done on a certain date. I have a particular way that I would like to have it done. And we can talk about it throughout the process. But please tell me whether or not you want as much freedom as possible, or you want very little freedom as possible. Now, I know that's one of my challenges, right? Because while I am a big picture person and it can feel like I'm all over the place, when I do something, it's very methodical, very direct, very on time. And so that can be frustrating. I have learned that from people that I've supervised, that I can be a frustrating person to work with, not because of who I am, my personality. They enjoy working with me because of who I am that way, but because of the way I work myself. So for me as a supervisor, what I've done over the years in order to meet some of the challenges, also respond to the culture that I'm working in, is I ask my supervisees, what is it about me that is challenging to you? Where do you think I can help you grow? Where can you help me grow? Because I can't see what my own blind spots are. And in that, again, back to LaFerrin in terms of the systems, then we are actually working out systematically how we do this work together and how we progress, right? It may be different from others, and it may be different in a different office. Everybody will not work with you as the way that I do, but that's one way that I check myself and my own blind spots just to try to work through this system so that we actually have something that flows well.
I think you brought up something really great, and I want people to catch it. You are open to feedback.
Yeah.
And so I used to hear this a lot when I was at Florida State, feedback is love, but I know that people don't believe that because sometimes the feedback they have gotten has not been given to them in a way that was constructive, but more or less it was a hindrance to them and not a help. But you are open to the feedback of like, how help me so I can help us do this. And I don't want nobody to miss, like, you have to, if you ask for feedback, you also have to be really open to what is going to be said to you, process your feelings about it. As Oliver was talking about, I call it church hurt, when people bring all the baggage from their previous relationships with supervisors and or organizations and systems. And I'm like, okay, so now we have to unpack that so that we can walk into this together. Okay, fantastic. But all of that is a part of it, but you have to be open to the feedback part. Just one.
I appreciate that from you all, because I hope people are catching the gems. I'm trying to take notes. Yes, Terrence, you all are dropping a lot of gems. I'm glad it's going to be recorded. A few things that stuck out to me that I want to make sure people heard was the need, I call it the emotional intelligence, to be able to see the person in front of you. So all of you have named the ways in which people show up, how to navigate feedback, how to frame. I think Mo, you said it, how to frame. This is a coaching conversation. This is a learning moment. Before coming to TPE, still being an associate director in residence life, our currency is people. That's what we just say. Our currency, our value is in people. And so it is never stagnant. How you supervised across the board or built a team 3 years ago does not work for how you would do that now, because the employees, the people coming into the field are different. They've always been different, but even collectively now, when we look across generation, there's a different need, there's a different experience, and you have to have the emotional intelligence to be able to read, to discern, to use some pastoral language, um, the person in front of you. And the other part about supervision and management, it is the one-on-one interaction, but you're also tasked with taking 3, 4, depending on the size of your institution, 6. We all know more than 6 is too many to supervise, but it happens. You're tasked with taking those individuals and making them a team. And so we do hire for a role, and we can say Marion is perfect for this particular role in the office, Oliver is perfect for this particular role in the office, Mo and LaFerrin together. But if I'm the associate director, assistant director, I'm also tasked with bringing the 4 of you around the table towards some organizational or team goals and pulling those strengths, knowing those challenges, knowing the things we talk about in one-on-one spaces, and bringing all that chemistry together to move a team forward. I would love to hear from you all to talk a little bit about how you pivot between the work you do with individual staff members and then how you also bring that together to cultivate a team towards that common goal. And of course, productivity. That's a word we don't like to say in higher ed, but it's there. There's some outcomes and there's some productivity that's expected. Talk a little bit about how you shift from working with the individual to bringing your teams together.
I just want to add a couple of things from the previous comment, and we can then shift into the team question for me, just that weren't said. And I think to name that in the spirit of these questions around like, one, I am a recovering perfectionist. I think most folks in student affairs are as well. And so I think with that comes the need, and how I support my staff is vulnerability, and so, which Dr. Brene Brown, all of her work is based on that, but also this idea of like self-compassion too by Dr. Kristen Neff. Just so both happen to be current UT Austin faculty members as well. But I think these concepts are really important. And I had the benefit of growing up professionally in a counseling center. My first job was being a suicide prevention coordinator, and folks in counseling centers process all the time. And so we get, the availability to process, and sometimes you can't process, you just got to do the work. But I was able to understand the gift of how are these issues affecting me, and then how am I either playing out my stuff on my team or not, right? And being really, to the extent that it's appropriate, modeling that vulnerability, because you are not, you were just not your work, right? You enter the workspace either virtually or in person with you every day. All of the stuff is coming that's happening in the world. And so as we continue with the three major pandemics of COVID, racial injustice, climate change, political unrest, all the things, we can't also separate our person from our work. And I think, and I also know I named again, as a white person, name the privilege and how I manage and do that. But without being vulnerable and practicing self-compassion, I can't separate my supervision from my team either. So sorry, Dinaja, I just wanted to share that too.
Don't ever be sorry. I told you, it's a conversation. We can absolutely ebb and flow. So you're good.
Well, and Marion, I'll pick up where you just paused, because coming back to where Dinaja was leading us next, I believe in the power of community, and I believe in community in terms of the work that we do. So for me, I'm a part of a narrative. I'm a storyteller within a narrative. And there will be stories that will be told about me. There'll be stories that will be told about others, and there'll be stories that I'll tell. North Carolina A&T has been around 130 plus years. It didn't get here just because I showed up. It didn't get here just because the previous supervisor showed up. And it won't continue unless we work together for another 130 years. So oftentimes when I think about supervision and engaging folks in that way and bringing people together with different approaches, different mindsets, and different ways of doing their work. You have type A personalities. You have people who are not very community driven at all, or communally driven, excuse me. There are folks who do want to only work by themselves. What I try to say is we are all a part of this narrative. And because we're part of this narrative and this story, what story do we want to tell together? Or what do we want people to say about us in terms of the narrative of this institution and this particular office? That's the way I start. Now, in the mix of that, though, getting to know people, right? I also then lean into what you just said, Marion, about what we bring to the space of ourselves. I try to learn people's stories, who they are, where they're from, what's important to them. I also share what's important to me, what my story is, what my family story may be, what my connection may be. I graduated from A&T in 2006, and my family has been going to A&T since the 1930s. We have a family scholarship here, right? So even as an administrator, some of the things that very much frustrate me, they frustrate me because this is a part of my lifeline, this university. This is not just frustrating me because the system is out of whack or out of order. And so when I talk to supervisees, and other supervisors, say, how do we help people connect with that? That we connect with community, connect with narrative, so that they don't become so frustrated with the minutia of what we deal with every day. But you can still see the big picture, you can still see the vision, with the caveat that should you feel that you need to leave, don't worry. There will be somewhere else where you can land, you can be comfortable, you can feel free. right? Don't bind yourself to something unnecessarily when you know you just can't do it anymore. And that's for supervisors and supervisees again. But community and narrative are important ways in which I engage people to disarm. It's really to disarm folks, but again, to help them see themselves as a part of the larger narrative.
I think you brought up something that's this idea, I call it the peace be unto you, when you figure out that this is not where you need to be, which I think is really a big part of the supervision conversation too, because sometimes we're afraid for people to leave. I actually encourage it. Like, if you feel like your season is up here, then that means it probably is, because now you are holding up space for someone who needs to be here, whose ideas that our organization needs, and somebody needs you, right? This is no longer the place for you, but sometimes we have trouble having those conversations, those coaching out conversations, and understanding that that is a part of supervision. Like that is a part of it too. And saying it in a way that's not like, oh, like you need leave today. It's not even that. It's just more or less like, I'm encouraging you to really evaluate whether or not this is where you need to be, and understanding that I'm not pushing you out, but I'm also I'm going to do whatever I can to help you seek life elsewhere that is in your best interest for what your career goals are and all of the things. But what we have, and that's when people start to get upset with supervision and the organization and the system when they've been there too long, and nobody has had the wherewithal or more or less the courage to have the conversation that maybe this is not it, right? Like that's a part of it too, because when you bring in that team conversation, so now we have pieces of the team that no matter what we do in terms of helping me find my motivation for this, my morale and all of the things, none of those things are going to work for you. And it's going to cause tension with the group because you don't actually want to be a part of the group anymore, which is okay. And I think people aren't telling folks that it's okay. Like, tell me if you're going to leave so I can help you. Not in a like, I need you to leave tomorrow, but just more or less like, so that I can be a resource to you. Because if I have not supervised you in a way that you feel comfortable enough to tell me that it's time for you to transition, then I haven't done my job. Or that this is just not for me anymore, then again, I haven't done what I need to do either. Or even if we haven't prepared you to do something different, we got to go back to the drawing board, and I'll take responsibility for that because I'm the leader of this team.
If I can go back to another point that Oliver brought up, because I resonate with that storytelling piece, Oliver, because that's critical to my approach too. And if I may pull back the curtain a little bit, Danaja, you before going live, right, when it was just us on the call, you brought up a word, family, right? And oftentimes departments and units and institutions utilize that word as a substitute for team. And those are two completely different words, right? And I'll tie that into kind of Oliver's comments here, because to me, the storytelling element lies in the beholder. And so in a team approach, right, you get to pick and choose how much of your story, how much of your experience you share with others, right? That isn't afforded in family. And so in the team approach, I get to navigate and pick and choose my pockets of who I want to be, right? And oftentimes in supervision, we have this unrealistic expectation that you're supposed to self-expose and be fully vulnerable just because I hold this title or this role and you're in my line of supervision. And that's unrealistic too, right? And so the storytelling piece really resonated with me, because the other part that we as supervisors inherently do is we feel some type of way when Oliver, who's not my supervisor, knows a little bit more about such and such a story, but I don't, right? And then that creates this trickle effect of how folks go about navigating those relationships, the politics on an institutional campus, and so on and so on. And so we have to take that internal look too, right? And just like we pick and choose our pockets of telling our story, we also have to afford that same opportunity to staff members in their line of supervision.
Yeah, and I would say, to that continued point around really team building is also encouraging and modeling your people to take care of themselves, and practicing that yourself, and naming that, like, don't be, if you need to send an email at 3 a.m. because it's going to make you sleep better, that fine, put it on Google Scheduler, so that your team is not seeing you sending emails at 3 a.m. Or better yet, just get good sleep hygiene. Practice that. It was really evident to me when I started taking time off during the pandemic, continued pandemic, that then my team started taking that PTO because they saw, okay, it's quote unquote safe, even though I'm telling them all along, take your PTO, take your PTO. They weren't taking it until I was taking it. And so be aware of that, of what you're practicing and how are you following through with, what are you preaching and are you following through with that modeling? And then when your folks are off, are they really off to the extent? Now I know every department is different. Res life is very different from my office for the well-being field. But the more that you can take the team approach to spreading out responsibilities, cross-training your people so that, we had a situation where we had to shut down because our team was exposed to COVID by a staff member, right? And so we had to have that backup plan of, okay, who can take this team member's responsibility because this person is sick for a week with COVID. So cross-train your people, and make sure that everyone knows what to do if someone is out for a number of weeks. We have a really small, I have a small team, so it's easier to do than bigger teams in the office. But that was really apparent. I also think being mindful of the caregivers in your department, and the folks that also, even if you don't care for anyone, you're entitled to well-being too. I think everyone in student affairs at Wake Forest knows, has seen when I moved to Wake Forest, I had a 4-month-old, he's now 2.5. And so I could not participate in evening meetings at 8 o'clock with anyone. I could barely talk to my spouse at 8 o'clock, right? With a 5-month-old at home. And so I had to really be vulnerable and say, like, I'm not volunteering for that thing on campus at 8 o'clock at night. I just can't do it. And be okay with that. And you have to support your staff in that too. And that does help with being mindful of that they do really all have families that they have to attend to in a variety of ways as well.
Can I briefly just touch on a point that Marion, I think, is, at least to me, talking about, and we just need to call it out a bit further, right? Is who defines professionalism, and where does that live in higher education and at our various institutions, right? I felt some guilt, some type of way when we all, to some extent, worked from home, but also had little ones running around. At a certain point, I got over that, like, feeling. I had little ones in my lap as we were in meetings, right? And part of it was redefining what professionalism means to the stakeholders or the beholders or the powers that be, and then role modeling that, similar to what Marion's talking about, to staff in a meaningful way without screaming out from the mountaintops that I'm role modeling or paving the way for others to potentially follow too.
I appreciate everything that you all have touched on. There are two things that I'm going to come back to see if we can dive a little deeper into it. And I'll reverse it, since Mo, you just brought up a bit about professionalism and modeling. Part of supervision, particularly if you are in a mid-level supervisory role, people call it like mid-level management, you have a lot of responsibility and no authority, which I think can be a flat statement, but there's a lot that's expected Your staff often thinks you can move mountains. And it's like, if you knew, I go in these spaces and I might move a molehill. But talk to us a little bit about the ways in which you have used um, the seat of privilege and power by role that you sit in to advocate for your team, because I know that's a word that gets thrown out. How do you advocate for me? But I think Marianne and Mo, some of the things that you all just mentioned are actually advocacy in practice. For example, over the summer, I told my team no meetings on Fridays. I don't know how I'm gonna figure it out, but I'm not meeting on Fridays. I will set a full calendar block. I invite you to not meet on Fridays. And they were like, that works in the office, but what happens if we have a divisional meeting? So that meant like, okay, I'm gonna go in management team and ask our dean to go to leadership and say, Res Life would like to not meet on Fridays. That doesn't work if our other partners want to meet on Fridays. I have to count my capital on how many asks I make of my dean, but that was one that during the midst of a pandemic was a small thing that would go a long way. If people could have 7 hours to not be interrupted by meetings, they might feel like they could get some of the project work done. Didn't have to shout it out. The calendar invite popped up one day and they were like, word. August came, they came to staff meeting and they're like, so that was this summer. Here's the real test. Can it last for the academic year now that everyone is back on campus? We tried it. There was some ebb and flow. It wasn't 100%, but it still meant that if they told partners no, they knew that between their assistant directors and myself, we were going to back them and say, yes, we are encouraging Res Life to not hold meetings on Friday if they can help it. So if you all would, are there more examples or ways in which you can share what it looks like to model some of that professionalism, redefine, advocate for your staff, if that's not going to be a trigger word for LaFerrin today? Yeah, I'm going to put that out there.
Yes, the word advocacy is a trigger word for me. Happy to discuss that at another time, but it is. I think for me, it's being very realistic with partners, right? Because during the height, and I'm going to use the word height of pandemic because we are still in the midst. I think we're in a different place in terms of how we are processing and doing this. My team, student health services and dining, like we were the thing that kept the machine going, right? And so coming back and being very clear about capacity. And so I was very clear with my supervisor. I'm like, we don't have capacity for this. Or like even in division meetings that I'm in, I'm like, we don't have capacity for this right now. So I have adopted a thing where something comes in, an email comes, like, because a lot of people like to send emails at 4:45 on a Friday. And I read it and I said, that sounds like a Monday problem. And so my assistant directors hear me say that and they're like, well, Farron, I said, no. What are we actually going to accomplish at 4:45 on a Friday when nobody else who would provide service are actually here to help us? Like, we're not going to stress about this. Now, there are things because we work in Res Life that are emergencies that you have to deal with, but this isn't an emergency. And I think that's what has happened. Everybody's emergency, everything is a crisis and an emergency when it's not. And it has put more stress on our staff, especially when you are down staff, right? And so being very clear and holding ground on what I was able to ask my staff to do more of. And Denaja, you brought up a word, capital. Like, I understand the capital that I hold and I know where I'm willing to spend and where I'm where I can't, and where I can move the needle and where I can't. So I understand the chessboard, right? Because that's what we play. So I understand it. But also understanding that I have to protect my team's time, especially coming out of a pandemic, not out of it, but coming to where we are in this pandemic. My staff is tired and exhausted. So when my vice chancellor is asking, how is your staff doing? This is not a time for me to be quiet, because she is asking a poignant question. How is your staff doing? And I was like, my staff is exhausted. I was like, I think there's a word beyond exhausted, but I don't know what that is yet. So we're just going to use that one. And she was like, she acknowledged, I hear you. Thank you. So that means when I say, can we do this at another time, that you also understand, but also know I can only say no so many times. I understand that too. And so it's that balancing act as a supervisor. And a lot of times, like those you supervise don't even know that these are the battles that you are fighting on their behalf, so that people don't continue to ask them to do things. And so for me, it's really been about that. Somebody came to me in August and was like, can you all do XYZ? I was like, that sounds like a September problem. So on September 1st, I'm happy to have all the conversation that you want to have. But right now, our priority is opening and training. That's all we have capacity to do at this current moment in time. And I appreciate my peers for being like, I understand, I'm going to put some time on your calendar for a couple weeks. Thank you so much. Because we can't, like, stressing myself out so that we're not going to do that. And so that is what I have been able to do over this semester, and it has been received very well, but it also helps my staff put things into perspective in terms of priority of what we have to do versus something that it can wait and it's going to be okay.
I think in terms of advocating, several challenges that I've had, just to be transparent, are directly tied to human resources, to be quite honest. If human resources, if their system is not in order, so much of the advocating feels defeating, to be quite honest, not only for me, but also for those I supervise. And so with my own supervisor, when we have leadership team meetings, I bring it up every time. So there's always a conversation, part of the conversation doesn't leave. And at the same time, I know what's happening with a partner office and know that we're probably not going to move anything anytime soon. But one thing that Mo said early on in terms of culture, in higher education in general, we have this often stated, but sometimes unstated culture of, well, this is just what we do in higher ed. We work all night, we work all weekend. And when colleagues on the leadership team, and I'm interim, now this is also the benefit of interim, right? That means that if y'all don't want me and I don't want you, I can move on. But you got to be able to call bullshit. Now that takes a lot of capital. It takes a lot of nerve and courage. But I can tell you as a preacher, sometimes you actually have to say bullshit in the meeting. This is bullshit. That's a hard thing to come to in terms of resolve, because we also have to work out our own sense of, well, I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings. Or, I want to know that, next week we're still going to be able to have lunch together. Or, you signed my check, which are all important things, all very important pieces. But some of this work in advocacy is being able to call bullshit in the leadership team meeting.
Go ahead, Marian.
Dr. Thomas, I'm going to use that as a new mantra. Just going to call some bullshit in a meeting. Yeah, to that point, what I also heard in that comment was knowing your values as a leader and living into those. And that could look different ways for different folks. I think one of the gifts of the pandemic for my team is that everybody, like, well-being is now at every table that there is at our institution. And yet everyone thinks that they know what that is, right? Where, it's a 400-year-old concept and we're still learning, and it's different for everyone. And our office serves not only students, but faculty and staff as well, who, to Dr. Merriweather's point, quite frankly, our staff and our faculty need this work in some capacities in ways more than our students do right now. And they are the folks that are asking and knocking at our doors and showing up for programs. So the advocacy piece looks like for me to work as much as I can, bring HR into the conversation around that we need more resources for well-being on our campus. It also looks like empowering my staff to say no, or saying no for them to campus administrators. We are not all the things to all the people. unless we just can't be. We can never be staffed up. We can have 10 more positions. We're not going to be all the things to all the people. And so helping campus leaders understand our scope of practice, where is our funding coming from, and how are we operationalizing that piece. It's also helping, advocating for my team when they say, okay, if you want me to do this, what am I stopping to do? So we saw that a lot. We had to create a whole kind of daily well-being program during the height of the pandemic for our campus, which was in spring 2008. Essentially every day our students were getting some kind of outreach from our office who were in quarantine or isolation, right? And so that was an all hands on deck feature. That was not sustainable. So we did have to advocate to administration, like we can no longer, do this thing. So those are some of the ways at which I think about advocating for my team.
I know we might be over time. Can I just get maybe two things off my chest? So in all that was shared from our colleagues, I see higher ed at a crossroads, right? We talk about our mission, vision, and values, but to use Oliver's terms, when bullshit hits the fan, right? We lean on like policy procedure to then outweigh mission, vision, and values. I also like to look at it as centering whiteness for those of us that work at PWIs. Whiteness can mean just that. It could also mean student life divisional leaders. It could mean administration at the university. They're going to look out for theirs. And so how do I look out for mine? Right. And I think that that's critical in this place of supervision. Right. And the example that I'll give is I created a space for an affinity space for folks of color, predominantly Black and brown folks. Right. The question came about, what about other affinity spaces? And I said, that's great, but the rest of the campus is yours. Right. And so how do we create spaces intentionally for folks that may be dealing or navigating or just living life, right? And then are expected to uphold these lists of demands or roles and responsibilities. And so again, I'm gonna take care of mine, right? Because the university or the powers that be is gonna take care of theirs.
What you all have guaranteed is that you will join me again over lunch to continue this conversation, because we could dive far deeper into this, and I think it's important. I think this is just the tip of the iceberg. And again, when we think about TPE, it's not just for grad students who are coming into the field looking for their first job, who many of them come out supervising at 22, 23, which again, for another day. There are mid-level professionals who are looking for their next role, or entry level looking to go mid-level looking to go into senior leadership positions. All of those positions are posted. There is a job search and recruitment process for every level in our field, and supervision, or the ability to supervise, is a key piece of it. The panel knows I share with them some Gallup research and articles that I've been reading, and there are a lot of nuances around, is the ability to manage or supervise talent driven? Is it skills that can be developed? Is it a combination of that? The other thing that I think Gallup posed that was very poignant to me is that most companies are rated unsuccessful because they promote people into managerial or supervision positions simply because they've been good at their previous task, not necessarily gauging whether being good at X, Y, and Z automatically makes you a good supervisor. I translate that to higher ed to say, as a mid-level manager, I'm familiar with all of my entry-level staff saying, I am ready to be an assistant or associate director. I also know that we frown upon folk who make lateral moves when we interview them. But what does it mean to think about compensating people for being really good at what they do, and listening to folk who may want to move up or do something different or get more experience, and that not involve supervision? I definitely think that's a conversation where I hope to have you all back with me again soon to talk about. But to wrap up, I do want to ask you one question for you to share with the audience. When someone is thinking about wanting to become a supervisor, or they are interviewing for mid and upper level positions that require supervision, I always ask people, do you have questions for us? And oftentimes they're excited and they're bright-eyed and they're like, well, no, I think you've touched on everything. If I'm a candidate and I am interviewing for a role that requires supervision, what should I be asking in my interview to make sure that I'm getting a clear understanding of what would be expected of me?
A year from now, how would you know that the chosen candidate was successful in this role?
Mo, that's the exact question I asked to the folks who interviewed me. And for the most of the positions that I've had where I supervised, it was that folks wanted me for the position for what I had done, not because I'd actually supervised people in the work that I'd done in different roles. So what I often ask is, of those who are interviewing me, what is your management and supervision style? And if they can't answer the question, we already know we're in trouble.
If their office has a departmental mission or vision statement, make sure you know that ahead of time and ask, how do you envision the supervisor to help you reach the vision of your office?
My question would be, what would be the thing that you would have wanted to know as a supervisor coming into this role?
Well, my friends, thank you for giving up your lunch hour. Maybe I think we're an hour ahead from, no, okay, we're in the same time zone. Thanks for giving up your lunch hour and spending it with us in conversation. To everyone who joined us today, thank you for giving your time to be a part and listen to this conversation. I promise this is just the first one. There will be many more. Next week, we will flip it a little bit and be joined by some guests who want to talk a little bit about things that they need or that we feel like supervisees need and look for in strong supervision. And then we hope to bring this narrative together to continue the conversation around why supervision matters in the work that we do. So thank you all. I hope you have a good rest of your afternoon. Take care.